Hello, everyone. Let's talk about Imperial Free Cities. What were they exactly? Imperial Free Cities were one of the more unique aspects of the Holy Roman Empire, although not without analogs in other parts of Europe. Um, they were urban centers that had what is called imperial immediacy. That is to say that they owed their allegiance directly to the emperor and didn't owe any kind of intermediary allegiance to any other lords. This is to say, they were not part of the Duchy of Bavaria or Swabia or part of Brandenburg or anything like that. They were directly under the emperor. Um, what else is meant by free? And how did this state of affairs come about? Well, that's what we're here to talk about. If we go back to the 11th century, trade began to revive substantially throughout Europe, and cities began to grow rapidly throughout all of Northern Europe. Um, and to understand exactly how they acquired their freedom, we should consider a point I made in a previous video, which is that in most European kingdoms, various offices, such as Duke and Count, were originally appointed and then gradually became hereditary. And though these offices were associated with a particular territory, it would be wrong to say that they owned that territory or that they had total authority and just happened to be under the king or emperor. Um, as new economic and social relations developed throughout these territories, such as cities and market towns and citizens of cities, as to say burghers, which prior customs didn't explicitly give those officers and nobles the authority to govern, the king could step in to mediate between nobles and these newly developed institutions and grant the latter a large degree of freedom from the former. So, for example, a duke might have been granted a lot of prerogatives over a wide geographical area, like Bavaria, and a right to a certain amount of produce coming from the land of the region, but this didn't entail that he had the right to other forms of economic output, which hadn't really picked up any steam yet, or the right to tax certain types of trade. Uh, and it certainly didn't entail, having a right over what was built on top of the land, such as, city walls and houses and market squares and churches and the like. And so, in this legal vacuum, the monarch could step in and he could play the ambitions of the burghers against the nobility, and he could give the former freedom and protection. Um, Typically in the form of a town charter that recognized that they had certain rights, um, and recognized a certain reciprocal relationship between the crown and that city, where the crown would protect the privileges of that city, and in return they would provide a certain amount of money or what have you. That's not always how it emerged, though. Sometimes lords simply lacked money, and they recognized that it would be a good idea to sell a town charter to a certain city. And sometimes the lord would maintain certain vestigial rights over the city or a kind of nominal overlordship, but the city would be more or less free. And where these different rights conflicted, the king might step in as a mediator and give them a similar status to those cities that he had granted a charter to personally. He could enforce the terms of the charter, and gradually it would be just like a charter that had been granted by the king himself. Um, in general, many of the major cities that emerged in massive fiefdoms and principalities would gain a freedom of this sort, although most did not. So, one process, in addition to these, which is relatively unique to the empire, was the process by which the old imperial palaces and cities gained freedom and imperial immediacy as the emperor began to alienate the lands that belonged to the crown as such, that is to say, the lands that didn't belong to his family but belonged to whoever was elected as emperor. And um, as he began to rely on those lands which he held as a hereditary principality to carry out the duties of his imperial office. So many of these cities, such as Nuremberg or Regensburg, would still owe some kind of obligations to the crown, such as hosting Reichstags, that's to say imperial assemblies, or providing, housing to the emperor at times. But they'd be largely self-governing otherwise. So the number of free cities um, was around 80 at the end of the 15th century, but it ended up being around 50 to 60 by the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. This was out of about 4,000 cities and towns throughout the empire, although typically these cities were among the bigger and more prosperous. While they did have seats in the Reichstag, their constitutional status wasn't fully confirmed till 1648, where they were given a set amount of votes as a independent college in the imperial diet. Whereas before, their votes were more advisory and didn't have any kind of binding character. So one of the really important things about the free cities is that they were one of the major buttresses of imperial power. Their relatively small size meant that in the absence of the emperor, they would be vulnerable, and so the emperor's ability to mediate between them and their neighbors and protect them meant that they were typically rather reliable allies of the emperor. One really good example of this is in the early 16th century, many small states, but especially the free cities of Swabia, Alsace, Baden, that area, southwestern Germany, were organized into something called the Swabian League under the leadership of the Austrian Habsburgs. And that allowed the Austrian Habsburgs to project a tremendous amount of power westwards in the empire at a time when their power was relatively more questionable. Although this alliance would peter out, nonetheless, the cities would remain important allies. But with the chaos of Napoleon's invasion of the empire, all the medium-sized territorial states, particularly states like Baden and Württemberg, started to invade and annex all the free cities. And this basically crippled the emperor's ability to project power outside of his hereditary lands, which precipitated Francis II's dissolution of the empire in 1806. He blamed the princes for wrecking the empire by annexing all these small states, as I've mentioned previously in other videos. Now, what were these free cities like? What was their territory like? What was it? What was their government like? And well, the answer is highly variable. Their constitutions ranged from highly oligarchical constitutions where they were ruled by a very narrow patrician class to broader and more democratic systems run by guilds, although there certainly weren't any cities that ran on one man, one vote, modern democracy. Those cities that were ruled by a patrician class, it should be noted, the patrician class was typically descended from those officers who had been installed by lords and kings to oversee or manage the cities. And then gradually these officials gained a lot of independent authority and became the new ruling class. They had typically been drawn from the minor nobility. In many cities that were run by patricians, the patricians, because they were highly endogamous, actually ended up dying out. And so it was often in the interest of these patricians to, let a few outsiders join their class. In other cities, things were, as I said, more democratically run by guilds. They would organize into councils and elect many of their own officials. A very interesting thing to note about that is that the cities that were run by guilds rather than by patricians were more likely to go Protestant during the Reformation. And for this reason, Charles V, when he defeated many of the Protestant princes in the Schmalkaldic War in the 16th century, decided to unilaterally change the constitutions of many free cities to a more oligarchical model. Citizenship, that is to say political rights, were typically restricted to those descended from the founding population. not from people who had migrated later, even though they might have lived there for generations, which is similar to how ancient Greek cities worked politically. Um, Although they did take in a fair amount of migrant workers from the local countryside simply because cities were often population sinks, but they were very averse to taking in anyone that might have been a burden to the city. Um, Territorially, most cities had very little land beyond their city walls, which is cross culturally kind of strange. I mean, city states, for example, in ancient Greece, controlled substantial amounts of farmland around their walls, whereas there was a much sharper demarcation between city and countryside throughout much of Europe at the time, um, including in the Holy Roman Empire. Nuremberg was one big exception. It controlled substantial land around its walls, uh, about 1,000 square kilometers directly. Um, and Other cities like Lübeck, although they didn't control much land around their walls, they controlled a substantial amount of small fortresses scattered along their trade routes to help secure the flow of goods. A last thing I'd like to say is many of the cities like Frankfurt, Hamburg, Lübeck, although they have suffered a lot of destruction uh, due to World War II, were major cultural centers of the empire and major economic centers as well. And we could see a lot of beautiful architecture there today. Um, and it was actually Goethe himself who once noticed that, uh, it would be very, very, very sad if the free cities all ended up being annexed by the larger states in Germany, which most of them were, sadly. Anyway, that was a bit of a quick video. Perhaps I can go more in depth in a future video as to what the governance of free cities was like. But I hope this was informative, and I will see you again soon, I hope.